Yeah.
Welcome to another episode of Culturally and Technically Legal, the show where we examine the intersections of culture, law, and technology. Today, we'd like to introduce a very esteemed and accomplished guest, Mr. Jazz Hampton. Jazz is the true leader in the legal tech industry, serving as a CEO and general counsel at TurnSignl, a cutting-edge Minnesota-based tech company that provides real-time legal guidance to drivers. But that's not all he does. He's an adjunct professor, entrepreneurial finance at the prestigious University of St. Thomas Aquinas College of Business. Jazz's impressive work hasn't just gone unnoticed, and he's featured in some of the biggest outlets in the country, including NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt, MSNBC, CBS, and NBC Top Story. So without further ado, we'd officially like to welcome Mr. Jazz to the show. How you doing today, Jazz?
I'm doing very well. What an awesome intro. I appreciate it. Maybe I need to cut that down a little bit, but
Yeah.
I'm grateful to be here and I appreciate your kind words, man. Thanks.
No, we're super excited to have you. Obviously, you've accomplished a great deal of things. Don't even think I was able to fit it all in that super elaborate introduction. But before we jump into it, we kind of want to just get a little bit of background, a feel of who you are, how you've contributed to the legal field. Because as I said, you've done many things, right? You start off as a corporate lawyer, you become a civil rights lawyer, and currently you're in-house general counsel and CEO at your own company. So if you could you take the audience through, your ability to find a means to adapt throughout this journey, and maybe you can share, what skill sets have you been able to use to maybe use in different places, but the same skill set to adapt when you are reaching these various stops.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And my story started a little unique and still is, I would say. So my undergrad is actually in computer science, which for anyone who went to law school or is planning on it, it's a really rare occasion. And anyone who is computer science, typically they go on to be a patent lawyer, right? I didn't do that. When I started in law school, I was a public defender. You can do that in the state of Minnesota. You can be an active practicing public defender while you're still in law school under supervision. So I did that for 2 years. And I really learned about access to justice and the needs we had there. But I always say I had student loans to pay back, so I went on and did the corporate law thing, and I loved it. Honestly, I'm a former collegiate athlete, and I always say being a litigator is like sports and suits. My playlist before a football game is the same one that I use pulling up to argue a summary judgment motion in front of the Minnesota Supreme Court. So I really believe in that kind of feeling that you get, and why I loved it so much. But yeah, then being in Minneapolis, we became the epicenter for a call for social change after Dante Wright, who my co-founders actually, our two other Black men, actually grew up with his family, and that happened in 2016. I remember leaving my corporate law desk. I was working on a case, prepping for a deposition. And I left and I went to like a candlelight vigil for Philando Castile, and I just remember thinking like something's got to change, but I didn't know what. Fast forward 4 years later, the whole world learned about George Floyd, and that happened about 4 miles from my house. And I was like, me and those other two men said we had to build something new and different that could change that. So we built TurnSignl, which is an app that connects drivers to an attorney on a video call 24/7, 365. But all of that none of that was the plan, right? When I went to law school, I thought I was just going to be a litigator. I'd make partner and I'd do that for the rest of my life, and maybe I'd volunteer pro bono doing other stuff. But what I always say to the point of your question around like the tools and skill sets is like I always look at everything I've done, from being a public defender to a computer science degree to learning how to take depositions and learning how to be a good litigator. All of those were tributaries to a larger river that I'm now on, right? And maybe this river is a delta into something larger. I don't know yet. But all of those experiences are what I hold true to say that everything you're picking up can be used in your next step, and it's okay to be where you are. Sometimes you need to be on the tributary before you get to the larger river. And so I'm not one that thinks you have to rush anything. So I appreciate all those different steps that I took kind of to get here.
So those steps are all important, and I think that's what really, builds the character and build who you are, especially in the industry now. You're so versatile, I think, and I think that's an important piece or a factor that people often look over. One of the things you mentioned is, your pro bono work. For those who may not know, could you explain a little bit about what pro bono work actually is, and the necessities it is to society?
Yeah, so if you work at a law firm, they tell you, hey, if you work at this law firm, you have to build 1,900 hours. That means 1,900 hours of your year are dedicated to doing tasks that are directly billable, and we would be paid for by a client of ours, whether it's Target or Best Buy or whoever you're representing in that moment. Then you take all of your other free time and try to find ways to do pro bono work, which is free work to communities or people who need it the most and can't afford it. And so a lot of lawyers do varying levels of pro bono. Some do none, some do a lot. And when I thought of pro bono, I just thought that there's so many needs that I see, especially as a Black lawyer in my community. And so I thought, how can I use my time to do that? I've done in different areas from domestic violence work to landlord tenant issues with people who were the little guy in the fight against the landlord, all the way up to, as you mentioned in the intro, I represented an individual who was wrongfully incarcerated for 19 years, and after a 3-day trial, we secured his freedom. And that is an example of pro bono work. I didn't get paid for any of that, but honestly, people always say like, "That's so great. I can't believe you did that. It's so nice of you to do." But like, I loved doing that. Like, I loved that work. You didn't have to pay me to do it because I loved it so much. And so pro bono is good for society because it gives people who otherwise wouldn't have lawyers an opportunity to have good representation when they need it the most. But on the other side, it's good for you. Like, it's good to do
Right,
good things, right? Like, it
right,
feels
right,
good,
right,
and
right.
it's a win for everybody, and it helps ground you in the reason, at least for myself, why I started going to law school in the first place, which was to help people.
Right. No, I agree with that. I couldn't agree with that more. I think you talk about, Marvin Haynes' case and how you helped him, and the pro bono work is essentially very, very important. But shifting gears a little bit, in 2020, the world was shocked. It stood still. In your home state of Minneapolis, Minnesota, we watched, George Floyd murdered, and that brought a greater conversation around policing in the Black community. Fast forward that same year in November, towards the end of the year, some of your co-founders that you've already mentioned, you guys got together and built the TurnSignl Act, right? The TurnSignl app, was a way to create a better space, a better conversation, a better opportunity for success on both sides of the law, the police and also those who are, being policing. A lot of times it's typically, Black men are routinely stopped more than statistically more than their other counterparts. Could you talk a little bit about, the background or perspective or thoughts that went into building this TurnSignl application?
Yeah, so Dre and Mike, my co-founders, called me and they said, "Jazz, you're the only lawyer we know. We're working with people in the community to build this platform. What do you think?" And I was teaching a law class at the time, and I just launched into lawyer mode. I was like, "Tell me how you're going to do all of this. Have you thought about attorney-client relationship? Have you thought about X, Y, and Z?" And by the end of that call, they said, will you quit your corporate legal job and build this with us?" And I think it speaks
Wow.
tremendously to both their personalities that they said, "Will you be the CEO? Will you lead it with us?" Uh, but that's exactly it. In that moment, we all knew that we just had to play our part in the solution, and then that just happened to be where I fit in the puzzle. And so we immediately started interviewing law enforcement. It was the first thing we did. My brother graduated from a local law enforcement program right here in the state of Minnesota, and I went to
Oh,
him. I went to his roommates from when he was in the academy, and I was like, "Hey, we're building this app. What do you think about this? What would be your hesitation?" So that when we build it, we're building it from a holistic standpoint where we say, when a police officer walks up and sees a TurnSignl bumper sticker and knows that it's being recorded, there's an attorney on the line, and that attorney was trained in de-escalation. Okay, now we know this is actually going to be the safest interaction for everyone. So the officer is going to feel safer here than he would in any other stop, or she would when she's stopping anyone else. And so that's the perspective we started building. Of course, then we launched into talking to so many other individuals that would be using the platform as well and learning what peace of mind do they have. Would it be okay if it was just a random de-escalation trained individual, or do you feel better if it's an attorney that knows the law and can help guide you through it? And from that, we quit our jobs in October, November of 2020, and we launched the platform in May of 2021. It was a really, really quick turnaround time and ability to build and scale. Granted, we started just in Minnesota and then moved on to now today we're in all 50 states plus DC. But it took time to get nationwide. But we knew we wanted to build a platform that would provide de-escalation, that would inform people of their rights in that moment, and then third and most importantly, ensure that everyone returned home safely. And we were able to build that, and now we get 200 plus calls a month of people saying, "I need
Wow.
someone in this moment to help me in this roadside incident."
Wow, that's amazing to hear. I think that people are actually getting help that they need. You talked about so many of the great things that come with that. Have there been any challenges that you face with the application? Obviously, when you think from a legal standpoint, could there be possibly jurisdictional issues, right? Depending on who's picking up the call for the particular client, attorney-client privilege, things of that nature. What have been some of the challenges in that space, if there's actually been any?
Yeah, I think the first challenge we thought of was letting the police know that we are an app to bridge the gap and not adversarial. If you look at
Mm,
any of our marketing or any of our social media, none of it is like, watch out for the cops. They're going to get you if you don't have TurnSignl. We don't want to build a bigger boogie monster than already exists in people's mind. So a lot of it is having conversation with law enforcement. And honestly, I could not, if I had a dollar for every time a police officer said, okay, I had this perception before we had a conversation, and now I completely understand what you mean. A police officer in LA during a presentation to 40 or so folks, he followed up with a call with me and said, you know what, I want to provide this to my son-in-law. Like he still is
mm.
terrified when he's doing this. And he says actively to me that he doesn't know about this relationship. And now I want to provide this to him so he feels peace of mind. That was kind of one of the biggest barriers that we had to learn how to navigate. And then from the jurisdictional aspect, you're exactly correct. We have to ensure that anyone who answers the call to give that guidance knows the law of that state. So if you're driving in North Dakota, the lawyer who answers practices law in North Dakota, and that's more
Mm,
so just because the rules are different, right? If someone answers
absolutely.
from New York and having X amount of marijuana in your car is not reasonable articulable suspicion uh, enough to search a vehicle, it's different in North Dakota or Nebraska or Florida. And so you just have to have someone that understands the law of that jurisdiction. And so right when they answer, they know the person's name and what jurisdiction they're driving in that moment, so that they can give them the guidance they need during that interaction. So that was something, again, that it took a lot of time. We started in Minnesota and we weren't nationwide for another 16 or so months. But we really had to ensure that we were building something that was scalable from a jurisdiction standpoint.
No, I think that's amazing, and that kind of takes me to my next question, kind of talking about sustainability, right? And we talk about bridging these gaps between law enforcement and the community as a whole. Uh, there was an act that was proposed, right? The George Floyd Act of 2021. It never came into full fruition. And as you mentioned, you talked to law enforcement, various people amongst the community, various residents regarding how do we bridge this gap between law enforcement, policing in the Black community, and so many other things similar to that nature. So, from your standpoint as a Minnesota native, and kind of in that space where all of these things happened that occurred back in 2020, and some things are still happening today, what was your take? When you didn't see this George Floyd, act passed like we wanted it to be passed and implemented into the law, because it did have opportunity to bridge that gap, similar to what TurnSignl was doing.
Yeah, I think and we all see this when we watch TV or see things in the news, that if you just laid out the facts of the things that were in the George Floyd Act, a vast majority of Americans would be like, "Yeah, that sounds great. Like we shouldn't do chokeholds, or we shouldn't do X, or we shouldn't do Y." And unfortunately, it gets bogged down in what is like a lot of political disagreement that we have in this country. I was going to say discord, but that would even imply maybe it's better than it is. So I was super disappointed about that. And honestly, that was a part of the reason that we started TurnSignl in the first place, because one of the phrases I always say is like, when we're struggling to legislate, then we have to innovate. And there was no legislation being passed that we thought could address these issues in the best way. Do I think TurnSignl solves the problems? Absolutely not. I think we are a small piece of a larger mosaic. I think that just like the social justice movement, where there's Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, I think all of them are part of an ecosystem that is, and all of them play a vital role in it. And we need all of those pieces together. And so if we're struggling to legislate, we just figured we'd have to build something that would be in every interaction. You can pass a law around not soliciting and knocking on people's door to sell them stuff, or you can install Ring doorbells where you can just they'll be in every interaction, right? Like you can change
Right.
it from a technology perspective that will do better than legislation, or at least be more immediate than legislation can be. And so that's how we looked at it from that perspective as well.
No, I agree. And I think on the topic of policy, right? You can't have a policy conversation nowadays without talking about technology, artificial intelligence particularly. More so in the turn signal space, how have you been able to navigate the legal landscape surrounding, emerging technologies like artificial intelligence or blockchain, specifically when it comes to your app development process?
Yeah, I've long said, if you think of all the professions from accountants to doctors and beyond, Unfortunately, lawyers are some of the slowest to adopt new technology. I think there's a fear. I think lawyers are protective of our industry as well. We don't want people coming in with nefarious intentions and just to solicit or garner money off people who really need help. And so for those reasons, I understand why we are reticent or hesitant, I should say, to adopt new technology. But at the same time, it has really prevented us from growing. There's still states that use like the three color paper in criminal court to write down
Wow.
things and give it to people instead of printing them off and telling them when their court date is or texting them because we all have a phone and we'll lose that piece of paper. From that perspective, when we looked at all of the ways to build a technology solution around this, one of the first things we said was we just have to make it simple so that whether you are a lawyer that is 75 years old and has been practicing longer than I've been alive, or you are a Gen Z attorney that's just coming out of law school, either way, you can say, I understand the platform and it's simple, it's easy, and I understand what it's doing and why it's doing it. From that perspective, if you can get buy-in, then you can grow and scale the technology in a way that is more sophisticated or more complicated or allows you to have additional technology on top of it. But if you're starting from a clean slate that people can understand, it allows you to build easier on top of that.
No, I agree wholeheartedly with you as someone who has, somewhat of a tech background. With that being said, you actually have had the unique experience of being part of the Google Accelerator program. Could you
Yeah.
talk a little bit as, a person in a tech space, how's that impacted your growth, maybe in a way of success to your startup? And has there been any valuable lessons that you learned, in that Google Accelerator program that you wouldn't mind sharing, to people who may be interested in that or people who just want to know more about that program?
Yeah, first of all, it's an amazing program. Matt, who runs that program, is unbelievable, second to none. I think of him as a close friend now. The program taught us. I could give a million lessons from it, and but the first thing I'll say before I give any lessons that I took from it was um, that program has given us a credibility that otherwise is really difficult to come across, especially as three Black
Mm.
founders. We know how little founders of color are invested in from a venture capital standpoint, and from even an angel investing standpoint. And we're all from the Midwest. When I applied to colleges, I didn't even think of a possibility of going to a school outside of Minnesota. It wasn't even on my radar. I didn't think of
Wow.
it. So, and not that I would have the grades to get into a Harvard or to go to Wharton or whatever the case may be. So you don't have that credibility either. People don't know what the University of St. Thomas and St. Paul is unless they're from the area. So I didn't have that. Having the Google Accelerator moniker on our LinkedIn and attached to our business has given us a credibility like that. That is something that you can't buy. But also, just like college, it gave us education. And one of the biggest lessons that I learned from that accelerator is how to quantify what you're trying to do and quantify it before you start. There's a phrase that I hear a lot that is like, if you don't know what you're aiming at, or if you're aiming at nothing, you'll hit it every time. What are you aiming? What are your goals? What is your OKR? What
Mm.
is your specific set of tangible things you're going to hit? And then when if it's over 4 weeks and you aren't on track to hit it in week 1 or 2 or 3, why? And do you need to adjust now, or are you going to wait the course for the end of the 4 weeks? Learning that process and our ability to take that and implement it within our business was huge because when you're in a startup situation, you really are moving off feeling and emotion a lot rather than saying like what are the tangible goals that we can track, the metrics that we can track to know if we're successful. So whether you're talking about OKRs or KPIs or whatever the tracking system is, have one in place, because if you don't have one, you're just floating in a sea of nothingness.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And before we let you go, I want to ask you one last question. Obviously, you've mentioned in your last response of, the tech space being an underrepresented space for Black people, also being in legal space, underrepresented for Black people. What are ways in which you've been able to navigate these two spaces to find a level of success?
Yeah, it is difficult, and I think for law specifically, I think making human connections is really important. You don't know the barrier that exists between people. We think because we look at someone and we don't have something in common with them, so we aren't going to strike up a conversation and do anything. There is no one that I try to pride myself on this. There's no one that I can't sit down at a table with and talk about something that we both truly care about. I love Bravo TV. I watch them all. I love
Hmm.
football. I love golf. Like I watch it. I listen to it all. Like I ride a Harley Davidson motorcycle. I also like speak French relatively well. I have a lot of lived experiences that I can connect with someone on. And that's the difference maker. And my dad is black and my mom is white, and there was tension when they were first getting married or engaged, and especially like even from my grandpa. And at the end of his life, my grandpa said to my dad, like, you are closer to me, and I think of you as my son just as much as any of my blood children. And that's because he
Wow.
didn't get to know a person of color until he met my dad, right? You have to just go out and get to know people. Unfortunately, that burden falls on people of color and women specifically harder or more often, and that sucks. And hopefully we get to a place where that isn't the case. But until then, you have to push to make the connections on a personal level, because at the end of the day, if you're a lawyer in a law firm, you spend more time with them than you do your family, most likely. And so form a personal connection where they're like, I don't mind spending time with you. Now, when I think of a case and I need an associate to work on it, I'll think of you. And finding that personal connection, honestly, is not that much work. And it makes it better. It's more fun. From a technology or a venture capital or seller perspective, you, again, I wish it isn't the case and hopefully in the future won't be, but you have to step in the room with confidence and with your credibility. If you went to law school and you've managed people before and you've managed a P&L before and you're confident in what you can do in your projections and your technology understanding, step with confidence into that room and speak to it, because people can feel confidence. And they can also feel if you don't have it. And having that confidence, if you don't have the Harvard, moniker behind your name or the Google Accelerator, having the confidence and knowing the answer to all the questions that are going to come is the real way that you can be successful in that space as well.
No, I love that response, Jazz, and super, super great to have you here. And just a really brief one, last one, just to push in.
Yeah.
There are still some listeners who may have not downloaded the TurnSignl app. Is there one point that you could leave with them if they are, I just say general advice, if you will, that you could leave with them if they ever are faced with a traffic stop?
Yeah, in that situation, whatever you're saying in that vehicle is the first step in litigation. You might end up there, and if you do end up there, it is 100% the first step. So whatever you're saying is the first step. Everything you're saying is recorded and will be denoted, and be intentional with your words. And just know, and the thing that I say the most about those interactions, like, you don't have to be rude to uphold your rights. It's not rude to say, actually, if you don't have a right to search my car, I'm not comfortable with you doing it. That's not rude. Not rude at all. That's also why we love TurnSignl, because you can use an excuse of saying the attorney on the phone let me know that I don't have to do it unless you have a reasonable articulable suspicion, right? That makes you not the bad guy, maybe. It makes it a little easier, but upholding your rights does not make you rude. It just makes you logical. And don't be afraid to do that. And you don't have to do it and I don't advise you doing it in a confrontational or rude manner either. So lots of opportunity there.
Thank you so much for that response, Jazz, and just this whole conversation. It was super great. We're happy to have had you. And definitely, my viewers out there, you should download the TurnSignl app. It's important. Everything Jazz said today is great. You could take with you, and just really, really fortunate to have had you here. And thank you for watching another episode of Culturally and Technically Legal, the show where we examine the intersections of culture, law, and technology. Please be on the lookout for the next episode. Thank you.